Hello, everyone. My name is Jaleesa Reed, and I am presenting a short lesson on covert research. By the end of this lesson, you'll be able to define covert research, describe arguments in support of and against covert methods, and distinguish cases where covert research is appropriate. Covert research is an investigative strategy in which the researcher's professional identity and academic intentions are hidden, either partially or fully from those involved in the study. In broader terms, covert research falls under observational research. Other forms of observation, such as structured observation, participant and non-participant observation, and ethical approval are all related to covert research. Covert research has two parts. Researchers who are using covert methods do not disclose their identity and do not disclose that research is taking place. Covert methods have always been part of social science research and present a crucial tradition of inquiry. It was once widely accepted for decades, especially in fields where ethnography is common, such as sociology and anthropology. In the 1980s, there was a change in the research cultural climate, and researchers began to focus more on ethics. Now, covert research is considered to be unethical or immoral to most researchers, but there are some arguments in defense of covert research. In contemporary social science and Western academia, covert research has largely been perceived as inappropriate, illegitimate, or unethical. Covert research is associated with negative connotations because many assume that it involves deception in research. These concerns are shared by ethics review committees and institutional review boards, who also believe that covert research violates the rights of the people being studied or observed. Covert research damages the pact between researchers and those they study, and these relationships require trust and time to build. Over time, these concerns have created an assumption that covert research always involves researchers who consciously obscure their motives, purposely deceive their informants, and disguise their identities, especially in the case of participant observation. This creates a problem because covert research becomes the opposite of covert research, making it vulnerable to censure without a clear understanding of what covert research actually entails. So, in defense of covert research. Researchers who continue to do covert research have pointed out the issues with assuming that all research that is not overt must be covert. Covert research provides access to information that otherwise may be denied. In some situations may morally justify covert research, such as the intent to reveal crime, violence, and exploitation. For example, conducting an undercover ethnography of the organs trafficking underworld to expose crime may be a situation where covert methods are warranted. Researchers believe that the majority of these criticisms are based on deductive reasoning, and there is little evidence that the discovery of the researcher's hidden identity or intention always causes distress among informants. Researchers also argue that deception and disclosure are overgeneralized and conflated. They are discussed as the same thing, but there are important differences that make one more ideal than the other. First, deception is a part of our everyday life in the form of social lies or entertainment. It's familiar in popular culture and the public imagination due to media scandals, expose documentaries, social media, entertainment television where people are hoaxed, and also undercover investigations like secret shoppers or mystery customers. In other words, the general public is more familiar with deception than researchers may think. On the other hand, disclosure is seen as a positive act. Disclosure is seen as an action on a spectrum instead of a binary concept. Researchers can choose how much they reveal about their research questions or goals, and this can range from revealing nothing, a little, or a lot, and they could still withhold information that prevents them from making a full disclosure. There are also instances in participant observation or participatory research where a researcher may not be actively concealing their research, but in the act of omission, the research may still be considered covert. To summarize, deception is when a researcher's position or actions are misrepresented to the research subject. In other words, the researcher says one thing and does another. In contrast, disclosure can exist on a scale where researchers decide how much they want to disclose about their identity or questions at any given point during the research. Researchers suggest that collaborating with informants through participatory action research is the best way to avoid concealment in fieldwork. A participatory research model uses an ethics of care and is rooted in reciprocity, relatedness, and responsiveness. This means involving informants throughout the research, from development to publication of results, by encouraging them to be co-authors and assist with choosing research sites or developing interview questions. Institutional review boards are also meant to provide protection for informants, but proponents of covert research believe that the IRB does not fully prevent any potential risk. Researchers are expected to predict where and when issues of concealment will emerge and assess the implications of that concealment, which is hard to do outside of the moment. They also argue that concealment is unavoidable because consent acts as a contractual agreement between researchers and informants, and both groups define their mutual rights, roles, and obligations and consensual participation differently depending on their understanding of the research. Yet there are multiple issues with the IRB and participatory research methods for proponents of covert research. Both perpetuate assumptions about relationships with informants by describing them as formal, coherent processes that are actually messy and ambiguous in field research. Some issues can be addressed through open discussions with informants, but not all of these issues can be predicted. Even an intention to involve participants in the publication process assumes that they have an interest in publishing or being involved in the process with the researcher. So here's an opportunity to apply what you've learned so far. This slideshow shows the conditions of a specific study design. After reviewing the conditions, decide whether covert research methods are appropriate for this design or if there's another method that could accomplish the same goals without overstepping ethical boundaries. The research objectives were to consider how identity was articulated through personal interactions in a business setting and to understand how these social interactions were intertwined with the business operations. The chosen research site was a bar with a mixed group with clear variations in gender and sexuality. The researcher was interested in observing social interactions in a specific context and discussing people's experiences with them. Their questions revolved around figuring out who came to the bar, why did they consume there, and how were their relationships negotiated. So, would you use covert research in this scenario? If not, what alternative research methods would fit these research objectives? This research study was actually done in 2006 in a bar called Freelands, which was located in a suburban town in England. The author chose not to use survey methods because they wanted to observe social interactions and also discuss people's experiences with them directly. As a consumer, they were limited to 1 to 4 hours in the bar during every visit. So initial cursory observations led them to need more in-depth time and observations to determine who came to the bar, why they were there, and how they negotiated their relationships. In order to spend extended time in the bar and also gain access to customers and staff, the author applied for a job and was hired. In the beginning, they did not disclose their identity because they feared that the bar's operators would not want to expose themselves to scrutiny. So their strategy was to become a sympathetic, active member in the environment so that others wouldn't feel threatened by the ethnographic intent. During their second week of employment, they revealed their research intentions to the bar owners, who were actually happy to contribute. From then, the author worked at the bar for 27 months and developed relationships with 26 key informants. This is a great example of limited disclosure. During the study, the researcher had to introduce their identity and research goals every time they met someone new at the bar. This happened in various ways and to various degrees, but the research was never completely overt. Some patrons had partial knowledge, while others were fully unaware of the study. Researchers who continue to do covert research have adopted a moderate approach to resolve some of the concerns brought up by others. This approach asserts that covert research can be and must be compatible with the prevalent ethical standards in the academic community. This reformist approach attempts to legitimize types of covert research by demonstrating its compatibility with recognized methods. There are 4 main points to this approach. First, lying must be an exception. Second, there are some concessions that are understood about overt and covert research. First, they are not clearly distinct. In some instances, informing subjects can be impossible, impractical, or inappropriate in the field. And while informed consent has good intentions, it does not cover everything that may happen in the field and usually only concerns the initial research design. Covert methods are sometimes necessary and relevant. They may be the most suitable way to get into the field, and in the case where researchers work on behalf of an organization or a group, they may not have a say in whether they can disclose their identity. Furthermore, some research methodologies, such as autoethnography, research conducted online, or research using social media, can be difficult to reconcile with the current definitions of covert research. Lastly, while the risk of qualitative research is low, covert research must always be considered as a last resort. This approach culminates in what Calvi calls situated ethics, where researchers only conceal their identities in certain situations and take full moral responsibility for their actions. In conclusion, there are a few situations where covert research can be warranted, and there are many examples of covert research that goes wrong when researchers confuse deception and disclosure in fieldwork. Researchers recommend a nuanced approach that considers the aim and nature of the field research. So regardless of signed informed consent forms, field research can still be hard to understand for people who are unfamiliar with it. So labeling research as covert can cause people to dismiss it on the grounds of ethical responsibility. Instead, researchers should focus on the nature of the study, the character and merit of the fieldwork context, and the relationships between the ethnographer and informants to determine the appropriate amount of overtness or covertness in the field. You can assess whether or not you learned something from this lesson by revisiting the objectives. Now that you have more knowledge about covert research, can you define it for someone else? Can you explain why some researchers are for or against covert methods? And finally, can you identify when covert methods may be necessary for fieldwork? If you can say yes to all three, then you have successfully completed this lesson. Here's a list of further readings in case you're interested in learning more about how covert research methods are applied in fieldwork and other concerns that researchers may run into in the field. Thanks for listening.